In our first lecture video, we finished by talking about the importance of school climate and the impact that teachers have on creating that climate and thus impacting a student's engagement. But of course, teachers are not the only variable that impacts how engaged a student is with their education. Parents, of course, play a big role as well. My father and my mom played a very large role in helping me as a student, although this is from elementary school and we're talking about adolescence. But the foundations that are laid at home play a large role in determining how important school is to a specific individual. Some ways that parents can change how engaged their child is with high school specifically and middle school, secondary education, comes down to the expectations they have. If a parent expects their child to do well in school, that's going to improve that student's engagement because it's a value that they're learning from their parents. And of course, we want to meet that expectation. Parents also are going to be, to some degree, involved with their child's education as well. They might, like my dad here, help with homework. They might even be involved working at the school. They might check grades every week. They might incentivize grades and so on and so forth. So involvement from the parent perspective also increases an adolescent's engagement with their own education. And then, of course, genetics plays a role as well. There is a correlation between parents' school engagement themselves and their children's school engagement. So we can never discount the role that genes play, even in situations like this. When it comes to parenting style, we have data that suggests that authoritative parenting is the best parenting practice to promote school engagement. To refresh your memory, authoritative parenting is when the parent is involved in their child's life. They enforce expectations, but they're also loving and accepting and encourage a degree of independence. In addition to parents, peers also play a big role in determining, especially when it comes to adolescents, school engagement. We know that friends tend to have the strongest impact on determining how much class an individual attends. I actually never knew that it was an option to not go to class in high school, and I don't understand how it would be possible because there are cameras all over my school. Apparently, I am a goody-goody, but anyways, our friends are going to play a big role in determining how important we think class attendance is, how much time we spend on homework, how much effort we think it's appropriate and necessary to put into our work, and then, of course, the overall grades we end up getting. So, having high-achieving friends tends to be very beneficial when it comes specifically to school engagement and the subsequent outcomes that school engagement has. One thing I want to mention, however, is the big fish in the little pond effect, where even though we might not have the same positive impacts of high-achieving peers, a high-achieving individual who is kind of outside of the norm for their friend group or even their school, the rest of the people being less high achieving, is actually likely to experience lower levels of anxiety and negative emotions than an individual who is high achieving in a group of high achieving individuals. So, while there are positive impacts of having high achieving friends on school engagement, it is possible to experience some higher levels of anxiety and other negative emotions in those situations. Although, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should avoid having high-achieving friends. Another interesting aspect of engagement and achievement that becomes an issue or important, a variable that does impact this during adolescence, is engagement with part-time work. Working part-time is actually very common for high schoolers. In fact, most high schoolers have a part-time job at some point. And we know that students who work less than 10 hours tend to not really see any negative impact on their school achievement. However, teenagers who have to work more than 10 hours a week do see some negative outcomes. They tend to have lower grades. They tend to spend less time on their homework, have worse school attendance. They report higher levels of cheating and lower commitment and aspirations. Now we're going to get to talk a little bit more about this in the next chapter when we talk specifically about work. But what I want to point out right now is this is not all causal. It is not necessarily the case that working more than 10 hours a week causes all of these negative outcomes. There could be some underlying variables. For example, students from low SES homes are more likely to have to work for 10 or more hours a week. Unfortunately, those students are also more likely to have these negative outcomes. So again, we'll explore that a little bit more next chapter. And in fact, there is some evidence that suggests that work itself causes some negative outcomes, but it's not necessarily a clear-cut picture. When we're not working and we're not at school, adolescents tend to spend a lot of time engaging in leisure time, as we've talked about in the past. So I want to look a little bit about the relationship between leisure time and school achievement. And just like the other outcomes we talked about when we discussed leisure time earlier on this semester, it comes down to how you're spending your time, structured or unstructured. We know that teenagers who tend to spend leisure time engaging in structured socialization, for example, playing on sports teams, being involved in clubs, or even participating in religious groups, tend to have higher rates of achievement. So, spending structured, socialized leisure time, positive impact on school achievement. However, teenagers who tend to spend their leisure time in an unstructured way, for example, engaging in a lot of partying or hanging out with friends, tend to have lower levels of achievement. So, how we spend our free time does matter as well. Of course, there are some other individual differences, things that differ person to person that we want to talk a little bit about. And the first one is ethnicity. Now, there is data that suggests that for certain ethnic groups, there are academic achievement and motivation differences, and that those differences become stronger during adolescence as the differences become more noticeable and more impactful. What I want to mention here is that all of the differences that we see in ethnicity tend to come down to higher rates of poverty for certain ethnic groups. Being from a low SES household makes it harder to achieve and engage at school. And unfortunately, certain ethnic groups are disproportionately represented in that low SES population. So that's all that's going on there. We know that going along with the low SES status or level, we tend to see lower parent involvement and emphasis on education as well. One interesting aspect of this is an emphasis on effort versus ability. We know, for example, that parents who, and this does tend to be rather a cultural difference, not necessarily an ethnicity difference, but certain cultures and certain parents tend to emphasize ability over effort, where they praise their child for being smart rather than working hard. And we know that emphasizing effort over ability tends to have much better outcomes. So that's an interesting ethnic variable as well. And then, of course, we see differences in friend attitudes for specific ethnic and cultural groups as well. One interesting aspect of this that I want to mention is something called the immigration paradox. As you may imagine, for some ethnic groups, it is very common to have a high degree of expectation that parents place on their children. This is true for many ethnic groups, where your education is the most important thing. Your parents are going to put a lot of time and energy laying that foundation for you, and that's going to be the primary focus of your adolescence. What we tend to see, however, is that the longer a family has lived in the U.S., the more generations the family has been in America, the worse their children tend to start doing in school. So we see a gradual shift away from that greater emphasis on education, the more Americanized a family becomes. So an interesting aspect of that ethnicity and cultural variable behind school achievement. Some other individual differences that we want to talk about: gender. As you might imagine, there are gender differences when it comes to how well we tend to do in school. And while there may be a prevalent stereotype in many countries that men are smarter and better at academics, that's not actually the case. First of all, there are no gender differences when it comes to intelligence, as my husband here might be sad to hear as we fight over football. We do know, however, that girls tend to do better in school. And there's multiple reasons for that. Girls report enjoying school more. They report having more contact, more relationships with teachers. They also tend to feel more cared about, noticed by their teachers and the administrators at their school. And they also tend to get more support from parents. Parents spend more time and energy helping and praising and supporting female children than male children. And they're also more likely to engage in productive pastimes rather than passive pastimes like watching TV or playing video games. So, the reasons that girls do better in school are all socialized. This all comes down to the different ways that we treat males and females during childhood and the ultimate impact that has on what we think is right when it comes to school engagement. For many men, for boys during adolescence, especially when that gender intensification begins to happen, they think it's not cool to care about school. It's not the manly thing to do, or it's not what their friends are doing. It becomes less important. So we start to see girls outperforming their male peers. And again, not because of gender differences or biological differences, rather, not because of intellectual differences, but just because of the way we socialize different genders. The last thing I want to talk about when it comes to individual differences in achievement is intellectual extremes or achievement extremes. Many of you have probably heard of gifted programs and likely had one at your own high school. Being gifted means having unusually high abilities, either academic, athletic, artistic, or musical. Typically speaking, we define or have a cutoff for being considered gifted at an IQ of 130 or higher. But you can also see students being considered gifted or being brought into the gifted program for showing greater than average creativity or leadership skills or even wisdom, maturity, things like that. So, gifted students tend to have a unique experience in high school. They, of course, tend to be very high achieving. They're often involved in things like AP courses, special groups and organizations. But there are some interesting traits about them that set them apart from their peers. They tend to be very precocious and independent, but they also tend to focus on different things when it comes to learning. Mastery orientation means that the focus isn't just on getting the grade, but rather mastering or becoming really good learning about the topic. So they're focused on learning in order to better themselves rather than necessarily just to get ahead or get the grade. That actually tends to promote better learning overall. We also know that gifted individuals tend to have higher than average information processing skills, where they can take in information, reason about it, apply logic, and use it and make decisions quicker than their peers. One thing I do want to mention about gifted adolescents and even children that might surprise you is that there's no correlation between being gifted and social skills. There's a stereotype that's very prevalent, especially in media, that really smart people have very low social skills. And there's a lot of data to suggest that that's not the case. We can of course, think of an example of someone we know who is gifted and socially awkward. But that's the exception. That's not the rule. There is no correlation to being academically gifted and socially awkward. They tend to be just as sociable as others, and in fact, sometimes even have higher than average social intelligence and emotional intelligence. On the other hand, We have individuals with disabilities. And disabilities includes a lot of different things: learning disabilities, speech and hearing problems, emotional or behavioral disorders, developmental disorders such as autism spectrum disorder, things like ADHD. There's a lot that goes into disability. The most common category of disability that we see during adolescence is learning disabilities, where a person has normal or sometimes even higher than normal intelligence, but experiences difficulties in certain academic areas. For example, you may be familiar with dyslexia. Dyslexia is a phonemic problem where an individual doesn't hear the phonemes, the different parts of speech, the same way that a neurotypical or normal brain does. You can experience learning disabilities with spelling, math, and all sorts of different areas. And this makes up about 8% of adolescents in America. What often happens with people who have disabilities is that they need a little bit of additional assistance. The degree of assistance depends dramatically on how severe the disability is. So you can have some individuals with disabilities who need constant help, who won't function well at all in a typical classroom. You might also see individuals with disabilities who do very well in normal classrooms with social relationships and all of the different aspects of the high school experience, but just need a little additional assistance here and there. So this is a very diverse population. We know, however, that regardless of what type of disability an individual has and the severity of it, early intervention tends to be key to helping these children succeed academically. The earlier we identify and sometimes diagnose issues, the earlier we get students into therapies, into different treatment programs, get them a teacher's aid, the better they'll do overall. Unfortunately, sometimes these things go overlooked, and you will have a student who makes it to high school before they're identified as having a disability, and that tends to be harder to overcome. Luckily, I think we're getting better at identifying disabilities across the board, and it's thankfully becoming more socially acceptable, so people are starting to get more help. The last individual difference we want to talk about is high school dropouts, because of course, not everyone finishes high school at the typical time. We know about 7% of the population by age 24 never graduated high school, and only about a fourth of those individuals end up obtaining their GED, or general education degree, which is a degree equivalent to a high school diploma. So, what leads to dropout? That, of course, is a very individualized question. People can drop out because they have low grades, because they experience high degrees of behavioral problems, because they have low intelligence or low levels of achievement, or because they just don't like school or they feel disconnected from their peers and their teachers. There's a lot of different potential reasons that can lead to this. Some specific personality characteristics, personal characteristics that we tend to see. The first one is a personality difference. We know that individuals who are especially aggressive or sensation-seeking tend to be more likely to not finish high school. They can't stand sitting in the classroom all day. It's not stimulating enough for them, or they get in a lot of altercations because of aggression. We know that, of course, high school students who enter into parenthood, who have children, are at a higher rate of dropping out because they have other responsibilities. And then we also know that people who do have learning disabilities, as we just discussed, are also at a higher risk of dropping out of college, or rather high school. But it doesn't just come down to the student. There are certain characteristics of the school itself that can contribute to a teenager making the decision to drop out. In the first lecture video, we talked about the importance of school climate, and having a low school climate does increase the likelihood that students will drop out. We know that larger schools tend to have more students drop out, schools with lower funding, and this one might be most surprising, schools where there's not a lot of expectation placed on their students, where the teachers and the administration and other students just don't expect each other to succeed. That can also promote higher rates of dropping out. The last topic we want to visit, ending by looking at emerging adulthood, is college, while we enjoy this lovely picture of Cameron. We know that college has become increasingly popular over the last few decades. Most emerging adults are at least interested in attending college, which is very different from how things used to be. The increase in popularity of college tends to kind of mirror the creation of emerging adulthood as a distinct developmental period, like we've talked about in the past. Historically speaking, emerging adulthood wasn't its own developmental period, but because so many young adults are choosing to go to college to experience or prolong that period of exploration and transition, we now have a unique developmental period, emerging adulthood, that mirrors the growth in college popularity. As I mentioned, about 70% of recent high school grads do go to some form of college or university. Of those 70% of students, about 58 of them tend to be female. 81% are Asian American, 67% are white, 66% are Latinx, and 56% are Black or African American. I point out those statistics to highlight that there is still a large degree of ethnic disparity between or within the college population. There are some schools who do a much better job representing all ethnicities in an equivalent way, but across the board, that's not necessarily the case. I do want to point out that these numbers are disproportionate to the actual ethnic distribution of our country. We definitely see underrepresentation of Black or African Americans and Latinx Americans. The next data point I want to point out to you is an interesting one. Which major is the most popular? We know about 20% of college students choose to major in business, 10% choose to major in health professions, 9%, so the third most common, in psychology or social sciences. Great decision, everybody. And then about 6% choose to major in education. So we see, what's that? Let's do some quick math. About 45% of college students choosing 4 categories of majors. The other ones tend to be much less popular. The next aspect of college we want to talk about is the idea that it's something that lasts for 4 years. And while, yes, traditional universities are designed to take 4 years to complete, that has not become as common as it was in the past. Most people actually take 5 to 6 years to finish their degrees, and there are a few reasons for that. The first one, unsurprisingly, is finances. College has become much more expensive and much less affordable. So you see people having to choose to spend their time in part-time employment while taking, or even full-time employment while taking their classes to finish their degrees. I also want to point out that historically we have seen a shift away from grants, where you were just given money for various reasons to complete college, to loans, the system we have now, where you are lended money that you have to repay. That increases financial stress as well. And I mentioned part-time work. Another interesting variable that has increased the average time it takes to graduate college is the likelihood of someone changing majors. And this is not necessarily a negative thing. As we mentioned, emerging adulthood, as it has become its own distinct period of life, involves a lot of identity development, discovery, trying out and exploring different options. So it might take you another semester or 2 because you decided that you weren't interested in business and instead wanted to become a psychologist. And that's okay. But of course, it does tend to come along with needing to take a little bit longer to finish your degree. So our overall question then, really quickly, we do want to talk about college dropouts as well. Just like with high school, we know that many people do not finish their degree, but when it comes to colleges and universities, that percentage is dramatically higher. Almost half of college students drop out before completing their degrees. We call this retention. Retention is maintaining a student in a specific program through the completion of their degree. Retention, of course, has a lot to do with academic performance, with the grades the student's making, but it also has to do with individual variables like ethnicity and the family's SES. Again, as I mentioned with high school, those ethnic variables tend to come down to SES, but there are some cultural differences in the emphasis or importance placed on college as well that can impact the retention statistics for a specific group. So, finances are one of the biggest questions, concerns we have about college in today's day and age. So the question we want to end on then is it worth it? And in fact, we know that while the college experience tends to be highly romanticized in our country, where we all imagine this perfect little community where everyone's playing frisbee on the lawn and going to football games on the weekend, we know that that's not necessarily everyone's college experience. But most people, the majority of people, report that it is worth it. Most students are satisfied while they are in college and experience benefits afterwards. The average college graduate makes $1 million more during their career than an individual without a college degree. And while that number is going to have a very high degree of variability, it's still significant. We also know that college graduates experience higher rates of employment and tend to view their degree as a good investment. We also see intellectual benefits, higher levels of critical thinking skills, better universal citizenship because of the experiences, the diversity of experiences, the diversity of topics we get to learn about, the diversity of skills we get to develop while in college. That brings us to the end of Chapter 10. As always, feel free to email me if you have any questions.